What if the moment that nearly ends your life is the same moment that quietly ends your career? Not with a punch, not with a knockout, not under bright lights and roaring crowds. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. But on a stretch of highway, under the sun, surrounded by broken glass and stunned silence. That's the question hanging over the boxing world right now. And it's why what happened to Anthony Joshua is not just another headline. It's a warning, a reckoning, and possibly a goodbye no one was prepared for. Because just hours after a devastating highway crash in Nigeria that reportedly left 2 people dead, the former heavyweight world champion was seen alive, dazed, and shaken in footage that spread across the internet like wildfire. Shirtless, silent, sitting inside the wreckage of an SUV that seconds earlier had been moving at speed. And according to people close to the situation, what Joshua said afterward stunned everyone who heard it. Not because it was emotional, but because it was calm. And calm decisions made after chaos are often the most dangerous ones. Before we go any further, let me ask you something directly. Have you ever survived something that made you stop and think, I shouldn't be here right now? And if you have, did it change you forever? That's where this story begins. Not with boxing gloves, not with belts, but with a road, a decision, and a moment that refuses to be ignored. It was shortly after 11 a.m. on the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway near Magung, a time of day when nothing dramatic is supposed to happen. No darkness, no rain, no excuse, just traffic, motion, routine. Anthony Joshua was traveling in a Lexus SUV, seated behind the driver alongside another passenger. His security detail followed behind in a separate vehicle. Everything about the setup suggested control, planning, protection. And then, according to Nigerian road safety officials, it all unraveled. Authorities later stated that the SUV was believed to be traveling beyond the legally prescribed speed limit. An overtaking maneuver was attempted, control was lost, and the vehicle slammed into a stationary truck parked by the roadside. Just like that. No bell, no countdown, no warning horn that mattered. 5 men were involved in the collision in total. 2, according to reports, did not survive. And one of the most recognizable athletes in the world walked away with what officials described as minor injuries. Minor. That word has a funny way of lying. Because minor doesn't account for shock. It doesn't account for the way your hands shake afterward. It doesn't account for the realization that power, strength, money, fame, none of it negotiates with physics. Within minutes, footage began appearing online. Grainy at first, then clearer, then unavoidable. There was Anthony Joshua, former unified heavyweight champion of the world. A man who has stood toe-to-toe with giants. A man whose entire brand is built on control, composure, and dominance. And yet here he was, shirtless, dazed, sitting inside a mangled vehicle, shattered glass around him like ice. His posture slumped, his face not panicked, but distant, as if he was somewhere else entirely. Not unconscious, not bleeding heavily, but not fully present either. And if you've ever seen that look before, you know exactly what it means. It's the look of someone whose body survived before the mind caught up. The internet did what it always does. It slowed the footage down. It zoomed in. It speculated. People argued about his expression. Some said he looked calm. Others said he looked broken. A few claimed he looked relieved. But almost everyone agreed on one thing. This didn't look like a man thinking about his next fight. Later footage showed Joshua sitting in the front seat of another vehicle, speaking with officials. He appeared composed, alert, responsive. No visible blood. No dramatic collapse. Soon after, reports confirmed he had been taken to hospital as a precaution. And that's when the narrative split. On one side, official statements emphasized that Joshua sustained minor injuries, that he was stable, that he would recover, that the story, tragic as it was, did not involve him being seriously harmed. On the other side, a quieter conversation began to spread, one that didn't focus on his body at all. It focused on what happens to a fighter's mind when death passes that close. Because here's the contradiction that no press release can smooth over. 2 people reportedly lost their lives in the same crash that Anthony Joshua walked away from. Same road, same impact, same moment. What makes one man survive and another not? And more importantly, what does that knowledge do to the person who lives? If you think fighters don't think about death, you've never listened closely enough. Every time a boxer steps into the ring, they accept a level of risk most people never will. But there's a difference between abstract danger and real, immediate mortality. This wasn't a left hook. This wasn't a bad cut. This wasn't something he trained for. This was randomness. And randomness is terrifying to people who build their lives on discipline. As news spread back to the UK, the reaction was immediate and intense. Social media filled with relief, prayers, shock, and confusion. Headlines emphasized survival. Fans celebrated the fact that Joshua was alive. But beneath the relief, there was something else. Unease. Because this crash didn't happen in isolation. It happened at a moment in Anthony Joshua's career where questions were already swirling. About legacy. About motivation. About whether the fire still burned the same way it once did. And then came the whispers. According to individuals close to the situation, Joshua made a statement in the aftermath of the crash that was not meant for public consumption. A statement that was not shouted, not dramatic, not delivered to cameras. A statement that landed like a weight in a quiet room. I'm resigning. Now let's be very clear. What that means, how it was said, and whether it was final remains a matter of interpretation and ongoing discussion. But the fact that those words were reportedly spoken at all sent shockwaves through the boxing community. Because fighters don't talk like that after surviving something. Not publicly, not casually, not unless something inside them has shifted. Ask yourself this. Why would a man who just escaped death, who is physically capable of continuing, who has money, fame, and opportunity, even allow that thought to surface? Unless the crash didn't just injure his body. Unless it stripped away something else. Joshua has always been a controlled public figure. Measured, thoughtful, sometimes criticized for being too cautious with his words. Not prone to impulsive declarations. Which is why this moment feels different. This wasn't said after a loss in the ring. This wasn't said under pressure from critics. This wasn't said in the heat of emotion. It was said after silence, after impact, after realization. And that's what makes this story matter right now. Because boxing is full of comeback stories. What it rarely tells you about are the moments when champions decide not to come back at all. When they look at the cost and quietly decide the price is too high. As the hours passed, official updates remained carefully worded. Joshua's team emphasized recovery. Officials reiterated the circumstances of the crash. Nothing was confirmed. Nothing was denied outright. And yet, the tone had changed. Something had entered the conversation that couldn't be removed. The idea that Anthony Joshua might be done. Not because he couldn't fight, but because he no longer wanted to gamble with the one thing belts can't replace. And if you think this decision came out of nowhere, think again. Because long before that SUV ever touched the road, long before glass shattered and cameras rolled, the seeds of this moment were already planted. And the next part of this story begins not with the crash itself, but with the seconds before it. Because what witnesses saw in those final moments raises questions no one has fully answered yet. And what happened inside that vehicle would change everything, and no one saw it coming. At exactly the moment everything went wrong, nothing felt unusual. That's the most unsettling part. No warning, no sense of doom, no inner voice screaming that danger was seconds away. Just motion. That's how people who survive serious accidents often describe it afterward. 1 second you're moving forward, thinking about nothing in particular. The next, time fractures. Sound disappears. Reality tilts. And your life divides itself cleanly into before and after. For Anthony Joshua, that dividing line appears to have been drawn on the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway, shortly after 11 a.m., under conditions that should have been completely ordinary. Ask yourself this. How many life-altering moments begin on days that feel normal? Joshua was not driving. He wasn't distracted by his phone. He wasn't alone. He was seated behind the driver in a Lexus SUV with another passenger beside him. A security vehicle followed behind, standard protocol for someone of his profile. The road was familiar, the route routine, and according to preliminary reports from Nigerian road safety officials, the SUV was moving fast, possibly faster than legally prescribed. Fast enough that when an overtaking maneuver was attempted, control became fragile. Speed does something strange to the human mind. When it works, it feels efficient, powerful, controlled. But when it fails, it turns instantly into chaos. Authorities would later say the vehicle lost control during that overtaking maneuver and crashed into a stationary truck parked on the side of the road. A truck that wasn't moving. A truck that didn't swerve. A truck that simply existed in the wrong place at the wrong time. Think about that for a second. A stationary object, an instant decision, and a collision violent enough to shatter glass, twist metal, and end lives. This wasn't a cinematic explosion. No fireball. No dramatic flip captured in high definition. Just impact. Brutal and sudden. The kind that doesn't give your body time to brace or your mind time to react. 5 men were involved in total. 5. 2 of them, according to reports, would not survive. And one of them was Anthony Joshua. When emergency responders arrived, the scene told a story no press release could soften. Debris scattered across the road. A vehicle visibly damaged. Glass everywhere. The kind of wreckage that makes even experienced officials pause before approaching. And inside that wreckage sat a man the world associates with strength. But strength doesn't look the same after impact. Footage later showed Joshua shirtless, seated inside the damaged SUV, surrounded by shattered glass. His posture wasn't dramatic. No screaming. No flailing. No visible panic. Instead, there was stillness. That's often misread. People assume calm means unhurt. They assume silence means stability. But anyone who has studied trauma knows that stillness is often the brain hitting pause because it doesn't know what else to do. Joshua appeared dazed. Not unconscious, but disconnected. His eyes open, yet unfocused. His body present, but his mind clearly processing something enormous. And here's where the story gets complicated. Because from a physical standpoint, early reports described his injuries as minor. No life-threatening wounds. No catastrophic bleeding. He was later taken to hospital as a precaution and assessed. From the outside, it looked like a miracle. But miracles can feel heavy when you understand the full cost. Imagine sitting inside a wrecked vehicle, realizing you're alive, while knowing that others involved in the same collision are not. Imagine understanding, in real time, how narrow the margin was. How easily a different angle, a different speed, a different second could have rewritten everything. That kind of realization doesn't leave bruises you can photograph. Witnesses described a tense, surreal atmosphere at the scene. People gathering, phones raised, voices overlapping, officials attempting to establish order. And in the middle of it all, a global sports figure trying to orient himself inside a reality that had suddenly become unfamiliar. This is where the public version of the story and the private experience begin to diverge. Publicly, the focus turned quickly to explanations. Speed, overtaking, road conditions, the mechanics of the crash. These are the details authorities must address. They're important, necessary. But privately, something else was happening. Because crashes like this don't just force you to ask what went wrong. They force you to ask why you were there at all. And for someone like Anthony Joshua, whose life has been defined by preparation, discipline, and control, randomness is the enemy. Think about boxing for a moment. In the ring, everything is calculated. Risk is measured. Even danger follows rules. There are rounds, referees, medical checks, time limits. You know when the fight starts and when it ends. A highway doesn't care about any of that. There's no bell to save you. No referee to step in. No opponent you can study on tape. Just momentum and mass and chance. The footage that circulated online captured only fragments of the experience. A few seconds here, a few seconds there. But fragments are enough to tell a story when you know what to look for. Joshua's body language was not triumphant, not relieved. It was subdued, contained, as if he were conserving energy, not physically, but mentally. Later, he was seen sitting in the front seat of another vehicle, speaking with officials. Again, no dramatics, no visible aggression, just conversation. Some viewers interpreted this as proof that he was fine, that the incident was being overblown, that the narrative of trauma was exaggerated. But here's the contradiction. People who are truly unaffected don't go quiet like that. Silence is not absence of impact. It's often the opposite. As emergency procedures continued and Joshua was transported for medical evaluation, the world began doing what it always does in moments like this. It filled the gaps with assumptions. He's lucky. He's invincible. He walked away. But walking away physically is not the same as walking away unchanged. Especially when others didn't get to walk away at all. 2 reported fatalities. 2 families altered forever. Two lives intersecting with Joshua's in the most tragic way possible, even if they never exchanged a word. And here's the uncomfortable truth no one likes to sit with. Surviving a fatal incident doesn't always feel like winning. Sometimes it feels like being handed a question you can't ignore. Why them and not me? What am I supposed to do with this second chance? Do I keep pushing forward, or do I listen? Joshua has spent his entire adult life pushing forward. Through Olympic glory, through world titles, through defeats that publicly humbled him, through criticism that questioned not just his skill, but his heart. He knows pressure. He knows risk. But this was different. Because this wasn't about proving toughness. This was about confronting fragility. As the hours passed and official narratives settled into place, something subtle but significant occurred. The conversation shifted. It stopped being just about the crash. It started being about what comes after. Because when a man survives something like this, the world expects gratitude, resilience, and continuation. A return to normal. A statement about being thankful. A promise to move on. What the world doesn't expect is hesitation. What it doesn't expect is withdrawal. And yet, according to people close to the situation, hesitation is exactly what began to surface. Not panic, not fear, but reflection. And reflection is dangerous when it leads to clarity. Because clarity asks hard questions. And the hardest question of all is this. If you can walk away from death, can you also walk away from the fight? That question didn't come from fans. It didn't come from critics. It didn't come from the media. It came quietly, internally, in the aftermath of impact. And once that question is asked, it doesn't leave easily. As investigators continued piecing together the technical aspects of the crash, and as public attention fixated on speed limits and overtaking maneuvers, the real turning point was unfolding somewhere else entirely. Inside a man who had just seen how quickly everything can stop. Because the crash itself was only the beginning. What followed next would ripple far beyond the highway, far beyond Nigeria, and straight into the heart of British boxing culture. And the next chapter doesn't begin with the crash. It begins with a video, a few seconds long, viewed millions of times, and misunderstood almost entirely. But what that footage revealed would shift the entire narrative, and no one was prepared for what it showed. The video surfaced almost immediately. A few shaky seconds captured on a bystander's phone. Grainy. Imperfect, yet impossible to ignore. There he was, Anthony Joshua, former unified heavyweight champion of the world, sitting shirtless amidst twisted metal and shattered glass. The sunlight hit shards of the SUV's windshield, making them sparkle like tiny stars scattered across the asphalt. His chest rose and fell steadily, but there was a rigidity in his posture that spoke volumes. Not pain, not panic, but something else entirely. Something that wasn't visible to the casual observer, but could be felt in the air. People watched the clip, replayed it, zoomed in. Some saw calm. Others saw shock. A few claimed it looked as if he were contemplating the weight of what just happened. And maybe they were right. Because trauma is never as simple as cuts and bruises. It lingers in the space between heartbeats, in the silence after sirens fade, in the mind replaying the what-ifs. What if the SUV had veered a centimeter differently? What if the driver had reacted just a second later? What if someone else had been behind the wheel? These questions don't have easy answers. And for Joshua, they weren't hypothetical. They were immediate, tangible, and horrifyingly real. Minutes later, more footage appeared. This time, he was in the front seat of another vehicle, talking quietly to officials. Alert, responsive, polite, collected, almost too collected. It was a strange juxtaposition. A man who had just survived a potentially fatal accident behaving as if nothing had happened. Some viewers read it as reassurance. Others sensed the tension beneath the calm. And that's where the contradiction becomes glaring. How can a man be simultaneously fine and profoundly affected? How can minor injuries mask a psychological earthquake? Joshua's body survived. His mind, however, was in a different battle. Think about it. He spent decades in controlled environments. Olympic gyms, rings with referees, scheduled fights with predictable rhythms. And now, survival was unstructured, raw, random, unpredictable. 2 men died in that same accident. 2 lives ended in the span of a few seconds. And yet he was left alive. Minor injuries. Safe. Standing. Breathing. Lucky. Yes, but lucky can feel like a burden when you see what others didn't. Because surviving doesn't erase responsibility, nor does it erase awareness. You become painfully conscious of chance, of fragility, of the invisible thread that separates life from nothingness. And as the footage spread across social media, the world reacted with relief, awe, and disbelief. Fans flooded comment sections with prayers. Journalists speculated on the causes. Analysts debated his physical condition. But almost no one discussed what really matters, the mental aftermath. Because that's where the story pivots. That's where Anthony Joshua's real reckoning begins. Even before leaving the crash scene, whispers began. Quiet, private discussions that the public would not see. According to insiders, he made a statement to those close to him. Not dramatic, not shouted, but deliberate. I'm resigning. Pause for a moment. Consider that. A man at the peak of global fame. A man with immense wealth. A man whose entire identity has been defined by resilience, strength, and public battles. Sitting quietly after surviving death, allegedly saying he is stepping away. It's jarring, shocking, and entirely human. Because the crash didn't just threaten his body. It exposed vulnerabilities that no championship belt could shield. It forced a confrontation with mortality. And in that confrontation, something shifted. Suddenly, fights in the ring, media obligations, public expectations, all of it suddenly seemed trivial compared to the fragility of life he had just witnessed firsthand. And this is the key. Survival often brings clarity, brutal and unfiltered. It strips away distractions, illusions, and the relentless pursuit of achievement. And in that stripped-down reality, Joshua faced a decision he could no longer ignore. Continue risking himself in ways that weren't necessary, or step back, reclaim control, and protect what truly matters. Now, here's where the tension rises. Because stepping back is rarely simple for someone like him. The boxing world doesn't easily forgive absence. Fans are loyal but demanding. Contracts, sponsorships, endorsements, they all carry weight. The public's expectation is that champions endure, even when human instincts scream otherwise. Joshua has always been measured, careful with words, deliberate in decisions. He rarely lets emotion dictate action, which makes this moment, allegedly framed by the phrase, "I'm resigning," even more profound. Think about it. What does it take for a fighter conditioned to persevere, to confront opponents with calculated aggression, to recognize that some battles are no longer worth fighting? The crash was the catalyst, but the decision didn't emerge solely from impact. It had been brewing for years, small doubts, long nights, physical wear, and mental fatigue accumulating like slow-moving storm clouds. The accident simply illuminated them. Now, imagine being in that moment. The weight of your own survival, the knowledge of lives lost, the pressure of fame, and the quiet realization that the person you've been fighting to become may not exist anymore if you continue down the same path. It's terrifying, and it's precisely what makes this story grip the imagination. Because the narrative of Anthony Joshua is no longer just about wins and losses in the ring. It's about a man confronting the limits of endurance, the limits of control, the limit where public expectation collides with private necessity. And here's the cruelest irony. While fans and media celebrate survival, the one person who survived must wrestle with a truth no one else fully understands. That survival is just the beginning, and the beginning demands a choice. The choice Joshua reportedly faced in those quiet moments inside the aftermath vehicle was simple in words, but monumental in consequence. Continue as before, risking physical and psychological harm for fame and legacy. Or step back, redefine priorities, and walk away from the world that has defined him. That is the moment where heroism is measured not in strength or titles, but in honesty. Honesty with oneself. And the story doesn't stop here. Because surviving the crash was only the first act. The second act, grappling with the meaning of survival, is where the real drama begins. What Anthony Joshua allegedly said after the accident, what he felt in those quiet moments, and what he will decide going forward. The answers to these questions have the power to shake the UK boxing world and redefine what it means to be a champion. And the next part of the story takes us inside those first hours after the accident. Inside the subtle interactions, the quiet conversations, The way a man recalibrates after seeing how close everything can come to ending. What came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Minutes after the crash, the scene began to settle, but the tension didn't. Emergency responders were on site, their voices calm yet insistent as they directed bystanders and secured the vehicles. Joshua had been moved from the wrecked SUV to another vehicle, speaking quietly with officials. No cameras captured what was said, no social media posts could convey the atmosphere. But according to sources close to the situation, the conversations were more than procedural. They were a first glimpse into Joshua's state of mind. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't begging for reassurance. He was calculating, assessing, almost as if he were evaluating the consequences silently. That composure, often lauded in the ring, now hinted at something more complicated. It was not simply courage, it was awareness. Awareness that his life had intersected with death in the most intimate way, that the accident was both random and definitive. Imagine sitting there, watching the chaos unfold around you, watching people stumble, phones flash, sirens blare, knowing two people had reportedly died just feet away, and realizing that you, with all your training, strength, and preparation, had survived purely by the narrowest margin. How do you process that? How do you reconcile your survival with their absence? The footage circulating online offered fragments of the answer. Short, disjointed clips showed him still, alert, but detached. Observers noted the subtle tension in his posture, the way he shifted slightly, as if carrying an invisible weight. He was physically unharmed, or at least appeared so, but the psychological impact was already taking shape. Trauma isn't always loud. Often, it is quiet, creeping into decisions long after the event. This is where the contradictions began. Public statements emphasized minor injuries, stability, and recovery. Nigerian road officials highlighted the mechanics of the crash, speed, overtaking, and the unfortunate placement of the stationary truck. It was all meant to reassure the public and contextualize the event. But privately, according to insiders, Joshua was experiencing a different reality. He reportedly began asking questions that weren't about the mechanics of the accident, but about life itself. Why him? Why now? What does survival mean when others did not make it? These are not simple reflections. They are existential confrontations. And for someone whose life has been meticulously structured around control, discipline, and performance, the realization that randomness can override all preparation is jarring. Even more surprising was the report that he voiced a decision, quietly, to those near him, that stunned the people around him. "I'm resigning," he allegedly said. No theatrics, no public declaration, just words, calm yet irreversible, suggesting that the accident had triggered something far deeper than physical injury. It wasn't about stepping away from a single fight or a training regimen. It was about stepping away from the identity and lifestyle that had defined him for decades. Pause and consider that for a moment. A man whose career has been defined by endurance, resilience, and victory, allegedly choosing to walk away not after defeat, but after survival. It is counterintuitive to a world that equates perseverance with virtue, and it challenges the very narrative of what it means to be a champion. From a public perspective, everything appeared fine. Videos, reports, and social media feeds emphasized that he was stable. Fans celebrated that he was alive. The media framed it as miraculous. But survival and clarity often arrive together, and clarity can be more dangerous than any physical blow. Joshua's career had already been under scrutiny. Losses and comebacks, intense public scrutiny, and high expectations created an environment where pressure was constant. This accident forced a collision between the internal and external worlds, a confrontation with mortality that no amount of fame or preparation could buffer. And in that collision, priorities began to shift. Because the reality of surviving when others did not brings an unexpected clarity. The things you thought mattered may not matter at all. Titles, endorsements, public perception, they can all pale in the shadow of what you almost lost. And for Joshua, the realization was reported to have been immediate, powerful, and transformative. This is where the public's perception and the private experience diverged dramatically. While fans fixated on the accident, the world around him, and the mechanics of what happened, the real story was unfolding inside him. The questions he asked himself, the decisions he contemplated, and the reported declaration of resignation were all part of a narrative no one outside that immediate circle could see. And the tension only grew because this wasn't an impulsive reaction. This was not the heat of emotion driving a snap decision. This was the calm, deliberate clarity that often follows trauma. It is the moment when instinct meets reflection, when survival forces honesty, and when a man who has spent decades proving strength realizes that the ultimate act of control may be knowing when to stop. Joshua's alleged words, "I'm resigning," aren't just shocking because they suggest withdrawal from boxing. They're shocking because they indicate a profound reevaluation of purpose, risk, and self. The decision to step back, even temporarily, disrupts expectations. It unsettles fans, promoters, and the media. It challenges the story of the unbreakable champion. And yet, from a human perspective, it makes perfect sense. Survival is a lens that reveals truth. When you see how fragile life is, when you witness the consequences of chance up close, priorities shift. What matters now is not glory, but longevity. Not fame, but presence. Not victory, but being able to look at the next day and know you survived. The implications are enormous. The UK boxing world has never faced a situation quite like this. A living, breathing champion publicly contemplating resignation in the wake of survival rather than defeat. It's a narrative that will ripple through gyms, media outlets, and fan communities for weeks, months, and potentially years. And this is only the beginning, because surviving the crash was merely the catalyst. The real story is how Joshua processes, communicates, and ultimately acts on the clarity that survival has forced upon him. Every conversation, every gesture, every public appearance following this moment carries weight. Every silence may speak louder than any statement. So, as the footage circulated and the world speculated, the internal reckoning was already underway. Questions of mortality, legacy, and identity collided in ways no fight could replicate. And Joshua's response, quiet, measured, but decisive, would set the stage for a decision that could reshape not just his career, but the way we understand the human side of champions. Because sometimes, the most dramatic moments don't happen in the ring. They happen in silence, in reflection, in the seconds after chaos when a man is forced to confront what matters most. And what Joshua faced in those quiet moments would prove far more consequential than any punch he had ever thrown or received. As the hours passed after the crash, public statements and media coverage began to solidify, yet a tension lingered that the cameras never captured. Nigerian road safety officials issued their reports, emphasizing facts. The SUV had been traveling beyond the speed limit, lost control during an overtaking maneuver, and collided with a stationary truck. 5 men were involved, 2 reportedly fatally. Anthony Joshua, thankfully, sustained only minor injuries and was taken to hospital for evaluation. From a factual standpoint, the narrative seemed straightforward. But for Joshua and those around him, the story had already taken on layers that went far beyond speed limits and vehicle mechanics. Surviving a potentially fatal incident while others did not forces a reckoning, and Joshua reportedly experienced an internal conflict few could have anticipated. Consider the psychology of survival in such circumstances. A man trained to dominate, accustomed to calculating risk in the ring, suddenly confronted randomness. A single miscalculation, or lack thereof, had claimed lives while leaving him standing. The physical trauma was minor, but the mental and emotional reverberations were profound. Reports from people close to him suggested that Joshua's focus shifted almost immediately after the crash. It wasn't on the vehicle, the officials, or even the fans. It was on himself, his priorities, and the impermanence of everything he had built. This was not an impulsive emotional reaction. It was the kind of reflective clarity that often follows near-death experiences. "I'm resigning," he allegedly said to those in his inner circle, quietly and deliberately. No cameras, no public broadcast. But those words, even spoken privately, carried weight. They signaled a profound shift in mindset. A reevaluation of purpose, a recognition of vulnerability, and perhaps a redefinition of what success and survival truly mean. To the public, this might seem incongruous. Anthony Joshua is a man of incredible physical prowess, with a career filled with victories, comebacks, and global recognition. Why would he consider walking away after surviving an accident rather than a loss in the ring? Because survival has a way of reframing perspective. What seems trivial in daily life suddenly takes on weight. What once motivated, the chase for titles, public approval, legacy, can seem inconsequential when faced with the fragility of life. Witnessing death firsthand, even indirectly, often forces the mind to prioritize what truly matters. This is compounded by the fact that Joshua's career has always been under scrutiny. Every win and loss, every public appearance, every comment has been dissected. The pressure to perform, to maintain dominance, to meet expectations, both his own and the public's, is relentless. Survival forced a confrontation with all of these pressures, distilling them into a single, critical question: is the risk worth it? The reported declaration of resignation reflects the human side of a public figure. It is not a moment of weakness, but of honesty. The same traits that made Joshua a champion, self-awareness, discipline, calculation, also enable him to recognize when the price of continuation exceeds the value. Meanwhile, the public narrative continued to focus on the crash itself. Fans flooded social media with messages of relief, shock, and support. Analysts debated the speed and mechanics. Media outlets highlighted the minor injuries, framing it as a miraculous escape. But the most significant developments were occurring quietly, behind closed doors. A man reassessing his identity, his priorities, and his future in a world that demands performance at all costs. This chapter is about contradictions. On one hand, Anthony Joshua was physically unscathed and globally celebrated for surviving. On the other hand, he was psychologically confronting questions that no belt, victory, or endorsement could answer. Public perception and private reality were diverging, and this divergence would become the crucible for his next decisions. The crash illuminated not just vulnerability, but opportunity. Opportunity to step back, to regain control over his narrative, and to redefine what being a champion truly means. But with every opportunity comes uncertainty, and with every decision comes consequence. Joshua's choice, though private, would resonate publicly because of the fame and influence he wields. It is in this space, between survival and reflection, public expectation and private clarity, that the drama intensifies. The footage, the reports, the speculation, all capture fragments of an event. But the internal reckoning, the quiet contemplation, and the reported words of resignation reveal the deeper stakes. Survival is never just about living. It's about deciding how to live afterward. And as the story continued to unfold, one question remained central. After surviving something so sudden, so profound, and so close to fatal, what does a man do next when the world expects him to keep fighting, and his own mind is telling him it might be time to stop? The tension of this moment is palpable because it touches on universal human truths: the fragility of life, the weight of responsibility, and the courage required to make choices that defy expectation. Joshua's alleged decision is not just about boxing. It's about life, priorities, and the quiet battles that define us outside the spotlight. But what happens next, how Joshua navigates this revelation, how he addresses the public, and how the world reacts, is where the story escalates. Because the intersection of survival, identity, and public expectation rarely unfolds without conflict, scrutiny, and, ultimately, transformation. The public narrative was only part of the story, while the media focused on the mechanics of the crash. Speed, overtaking, the stationary truck. Joshua's internal world was undergoing a seismic shift. According to sources close to him, he was quiet, introspective, and unusually contemplative in the hours following the accident. Not because he was panicking, not because he felt guilty, though survivor's guilt is often subtle and insidious, but because he was confronting questions that few athletes ever face. How fragile is life? How much of it should I risk for my career? And when is the fight truly over? Anthony Joshua's career has always been defined by preparation, strategy, and an acute understanding of risk. He's built a legacy on knowing how to take control in the ring. But on the highway, control is an illusion. There's no referee, no round limits, no rules beyond physics and chance. And in that moment, reality doesn't negotiate. It simply exists and forces you to reckon with it. Witnesses described Joshua as calm but distant. There was no dramatic panic, no flailing, just a stillness that, to the untrained eye, might appear composed. But anyone who has survived trauma knows better. Stillness often masks a storm of thoughts, a rapid-fire assessment of life, legacy, and mortality. The difference between life and death, he realized, is a hairline margin, a twist of fate, a fleeting moment that can never be repeated or controlled. This realization reportedly led to a private declaration. "I'm resigning." These words, while not publicly announced, were confirmed by people close to him. The statement was deliberate, calm, and quiet, a contrast to the chaos surrounding the crash. And yet, it carried profound weight. Because this was not a declaration made in anger or defeat, but in clarity. Think about that for a moment. A man whose life has been defined by endurance and resilience suddenly acknowledges a boundary. A boundary not set by opponents or critics, but by the stark awareness of vulnerability and the fragility of life. For the public, this moment is difficult to comprehend. Joshua is an icon, a symbol of strength, a living testament to human perseverance. To imagine him walking away voluntarily, especially after surviving an accident that others did not, is counterintuitive. Yet survival can change priorities in ways no external achievement can influence. Inside his circle, sources report that the conversation was about more than stepping away from boxing. It was about survival, purpose, and the cost of continuing. The near-death experience catalyzed a re-evaluation of what truly matters: health, family, legacy, and personal peace. Fame, wealth, and titles, once motivating forces, suddenly seemed secondary. This is where the story intensifies. The public sees the headlines. Joshua survives crash. They see the minor injuries, the hospital report, and the reassurances from officials. They see the footage, brief clips of him alert, speaking with officials, composed. But they do not see the private reckoning. The tension between physical survival and psychological reckoning is invisible, yet it drives the narrative more than any collision ever could. Moreover, this internal conflict has implications far beyond the immediate aftermath. The decision to step back, even quietly, disrupts expectations. The boxing community, promoters, fans, and sponsors all operate under assumptions that champions endure, persevere, and continue to perform. Joshua's private statement challenges those assumptions, forcing everyone to reconcile admiration for resilience with respect for personal limits. The crash exposed another layer of complexity: identity. For a man whose public persona is defined by strength, endurance, and victory, stepping back requires confronting a question athletes rarely face. Who are you when the gloves are off? What defines you when the battles that once seemed paramount suddenly pale in significance compared to the fragility of life itself? According to sources, Joshua did not make a snap decision. It was a quiet, deliberate recognition, a moment of clarity that emerges only after surviving something profound. His choice, reportedly verbalized in a private circle, reflects the tension between public expectation and personal truth. And this tension is far from resolved. From a narrative standpoint, this is where the story pivots. The initial shock of the crash is replaced by a subtler, yet more profound drama. The quiet evolution of a champion confronting mortality, evaluating priorities, and considering a future that may no longer include the ring. Ask yourself, how often do we, as spectators, understand that surviving an accident can carry consequences more profound than physical injury? That it can alter ambitions, reshape purpose, and challenge identity? This is the reality Joshua now faces. And while the public focuses on speed limits, overtaking maneuvers, and viral footage, the real drama continues behind closed doors. Conversations with his team, family, and advisors revolve around risk, responsibility, and the weight of decisions that cannot be undone. Every action, every word, and every pause is scrutinized, even if the world doesn't see it. This private narrative is a mirror to our universal experience. Survival is only the beginning. The challenge that follows is internal, complex, and deeply human. It forces reflection, evaluation, and sometimes difficult choices that defy expectation. For Anthony Joshua, surviving the crash did not return him to normalcy. It created a crossroads. The decisions he faces now, about whether to continue fighting, how to manage public expectation, and how to protect his future, are more consequential than any bout he has ever fought. And this is where the story accelerates. Because surviving is just the first act. The second act, the confrontation with purpose, mortality, and identity, is the part that will redefine his legacy, challenge public assumptions, and captivate audiences far more than the accident itself. The aftermath of the crash revealed a tension that could not be smoothed over by official statements or media reports. To the public, Anthony Joshua appeared physically unharmed, stable, and alert. Videos circulating online showed him sitting upright, speaking with officials, his body seemingly composed. Social media erupted with relief, admiration, and shock. Headlines praised the miraculous escape, emphasizing that the former heavyweight champion had walked away from an incident that claimed 2 lives. But beneath the surface, the reality was far more complex. Survivors of traumatic events often experience something that cannot be captured on video, a profound shift in perception. Joshua, sources reported, was no exception. His thoughts were not on public perception, fame, or upcoming fights. They were on mortality, fragility, and the sudden, stark contrast between life and death. 2 reported fatalities in the same collision underscored the precariousness of existence. And for someone whose career has been defined by control, calculation, and physical dominance, realizing that life's randomness does not negotiate with talent or preparation can be both shocking and humbling. This was more than physical survival. It was psychological confrontation. According to insiders, Joshua began to question not only the trajectory of his career, but also the value of the risks he continued to take. He reportedly said, quietly and deliberately, "I'm resigning." Pause for a moment and reflect on that. A man whose identity, public image, and life's work are defined by resilience and dominance, articulating the possibility of stepping away, not in anger or defeat, but in measured clarity. This statement, even if private, is seismic. It disrupts the narrative that survival automatically demands continuation. It challenges expectations, fans, and the entire boxing community. Joshua's alleged declaration was not a response to physical incapacity. He had sustained minor injuries. He was awake, alert, and able. The decision was born from reflection, from the sudden clarity that follows brushes with mortality. Survival forced a confrontation with priorities. Family, personal health, and self-preservation suddenly outweighed public expectation and the pursuit of glory. This moment illustrates a universal truth about trauma. It reframes values. What once motivated becomes secondary. What once seemed urgent may now appear trivial. The glare of the spotlight is replaced by a quieter, yet more insistent, question: what matters most when life has revealed its fragility? Meanwhile, the public narrative continued to focus on tangible details: speed, the overtaking maneuver, the mechanics of the collision. Fans debated how the accident happened. Analysts dissected the SUV's movement and the truck's position. Social media buzzed with clips of Joshua calm and composed. Yet none of these external narratives captured the internal reckoning. Surviving does not erase the awareness of mortality, it intensifies it. And for Joshua, that awareness reportedly manifested in contemplation of retirement, a quiet, deliberate acknowledgement of limits that few outside his inner circle could comprehend. The juxtaposition is stark. Publicly, he is celebrated for surviving. Privately, he grapples with the implications of survival. This duality, between outward appearances and inward reflection, creates a tension that is central to the story. It is a tension that humanizes him while challenging assumptions about what it means to be a champion. Joshua's career has been under constant scrutiny. Every fight, every statement, every public appearance has been analyzed. In the ring, he controlled outcomes through preparation and strategy. Outside of it, he navigated fame, expectations, and the pressures of legacy. The crash introduced a variable beyond control: randomness. And randomness, for someone like Joshua, is destabilizing. According to sources, the reported declaration of resignation was not impulsive. It was considered. It was deliberate. It reflected the kind of clarity that only emerges when one is faced with the stark reality of mortality. It is the moment when priorities crystallize, when the abstract value of life becomes tangible, and when public expectation is weighed against personal truth. This moment also highlights the human side of public figures. While the world sees strength, fame, and resilience, it rarely sees the quiet moments of decision, reflection, and vulnerability that define real courage. Walking away, in this context, may be the ultimate act of strength. For Joshua, survival has not ended the narrative. It has merely shifted it. The physical escape from danger is complete, but the psychological journey is just beginning. How he reconciles his identity as a champion with the reality of fragility, how he communicates his choices to the public, and how he navigates the pressures of expectation. All of this constitutes the next chapter in his life story. The implications extend beyond boxing. They touch on universal questions. How do we respond when faced with the fragility of life? When is it wise to step back, and when must we persevere? How do we balance public expectation with personal truth? Joshua's experience becomes a lens through which these questions can be explored. As media coverage continues and social media debates rage, the most significant developments remain unseen. The private deliberations, the conversations with family and advisors, and the internal negotiation between ambition and survival. Every gesture, every pause, every statement now carries amplified weight, because the world understands that what happened on that highway may have altered the course of a life and a career forever. And while the public applauds survival, the real challenge lies in what comes next. Because surviving an accident is only the beginning. The more profound task is living after it, with clarity, with honesty, and, potentially, with the courage to redefine what it means to be a champion. The first few hours after the crash were a blur for those directly involved, but for Anthony Joshua, every second seemed magnified. According to sources close to him, he was acutely aware of the narrow margin between life and death. Each movement, each thought, seemed loaded with meaning. This was not simply a fight for physical survival. His body had survived, but an internal confrontation with purpose, priorities, and mortality. Consider the psychological impact of such an event. Trauma experts note that near-death experiences often catalyze a reassessment of life. Decisions, ambitions, and long-standing commitments are weighed against the stark reality of existence. For a man whose life has been rigorously structured around control, discipline, and external achievement, the collision of randomness and mortality can provoke profound introspection. Joshua reportedly began reflecting quietly on his career, his responsibilities, and the potential consequences of continuing in a profession where physical risk is inherent. The alleged words, "I'm resigning," represent not panic, but deliberation, a measured acknowledgement that survival can redefine priorities. This statement, though private, suggests that his perspective shifted immediately. The risks associated with the ring suddenly carried a sharper, more personal significance. Publicly, media coverage emphasized the mechanics of the accident. Officials reported that the SUV had been traveling beyond the legal speed limit, lost control during an overtaking maneuver, and collided with a stationary truck. 2 men reportedly died in the incident, 5 were involved in total, and Joshua sustained minor injuries. To outsiders, the narrative appeared clear: a miraculous survival, minor physical injuries, and a story of near tragedy. Privately, however, Joshua's experience was more nuanced. Witnesses noted his calm demeanor at the scene, but sources say this calm masked intense internal processing. Survivors often describe a dissociation following trauma, a state where the mind tries to reconcile survival with the sudden presence of mortality. For Joshua, this dissociation may have been compounded by the public nature of his life. Every reaction, gesture, and statement carries scrutiny, amplifying the tension between private reckoning and external expectation. The alleged declaration of resignation is striking because it underscores the human response to extreme circumstances. Joshua's body survived, but the awareness of vulnerability prompted him to question the future path of his career. It is not uncommon for elite athletes to confront such existential questions, yet few do so in a way that reaches the public consciousness. In Joshua's case, the tension between private reflection and public visibility makes the narrative even more compelling. His alleged words, quietly spoken, deliberate, and calm, signal a reorientation of values. Where once victory, legacy, and public perception dominated decision-making, survival now foregrounded health, personal fulfillment, and the consideration of family. The near-fatal accident became a catalyst for evaluating the cost of continued competition, both physically and psychologically. The juxtaposition is stark. Publicly, the story focuses on minor injuries and survival. Privately, it involves contemplation, moral reasoning, and the recognition of limits. This duality is central to understanding the magnitude of the moment. It is a reminder that survival is rarely an endpoint. It is a pivot toward introspection, reevaluation, and, potentially, transformative decision-making. Joshua's internal reckoning also highlights the fragility of human identity, particularly for individuals whose sense of self is closely tied to physical achievement. The man who dominates in the ring confronts a reality outside his control, where skill and preparation cannot fully mitigate risk. The highway, in this sense, becomes a metaphor. Life is unpredictable, and survival does not guarantee mastery. Sources indicate that conversations with his team and family began almost immediately. These discussions reportedly focused on risk, purpose, and the implications of continuing in boxing after witnessing firsthand how tenuous life can be. Decisions regarding future fights, public statements, and long-term career planning became urgent considerations, made more complex by the public's expectation of resilience and continuation. This moment also underscores a broader truth about human experience. Encountering mortality often precipitates clarity. What was once abstract becomes immediate. Priorities shift. Decisions are reframed. In Joshua's case, the experience may have forced him to confront a question rarely posed to athletes at the peak of their careers. Is the pursuit of achievement worth the personal cost when life itself has proven fragile? Public fascination with the crash is understandable. Footage, news reports, and social media commentary provide fragments of the event, but the most consequential developments occurred privately. Inside Joshua's mind, in conversations with advisors, and in the quiet deliberation that follows survival. These internal processes, though invisible to the public, are the real drama. The navigation of purpose, identity, and the courage to potentially step away from a life-defining career. The narrative tension is heightened because the world expects continuation. Fans anticipate comebacks. Media anticipates statements. Promoters anticipate fights. Yet Joshua's experience challenges those assumptions. Survival does not mandate performance. Mortality reframes ambition. And the decision to potentially step back, allegedly encapsulated in his private statement, is a radical assertion of agency over circumstance. As time progresses, the focus will shift from the mechanics of the accident to the ramifications of Joshua's introspection. How he addresses the public, negotiates contractual obligations, and reconciles personal truth with external expectation will determine the next chapter of his life story. It is a reminder that survival is not merely a physical act. It is a psychological journey that demands courage, honesty, and introspection. And as Joshua navigates this delicate balance between public expectation and private clarity, one question remains central. How does a man who has faced every opponent imaginable confront the ultimate opponent, his own mortality, his own priorities, and his own definition of purpose? As the dust settled on the Lagos-Ibadan expressway, the immediate chaos gave way to quiet reflection. For most of the world, Anthony Joshua's story seemed to end with survival. Minor injuries, hospital evaluation, and a miraculous escape from an accident that claimed 2 lives. But survival, as insiders and experts note, is rarely a simple triumph. It is a catalyst, a force that exposes vulnerability, demands introspection, and, for some, reshapes the very framework of life itself. Joshua reportedly began to wrestle with profound questions. For a man whose life had been defined by physical dominance, meticulous preparation, and public expectation, the experience of near-death presented an unfamiliar challenge: understanding the value of life outside of performance. The accident did not merely threaten his body. It illuminated the fragility of existence, the randomness of fate, and the delicate lines separating life from death. Witnesses at the scene described him as unusually still, quiet, and contemplative, while cameras captured his composed posture, alertness, and interaction with officials. Those who were close noted an intensity that the footage did not convey. Survival had shifted his focus inward. It was no longer about titles, fights, or public perception. It was about reflection, priorities, and the realization that the cost of continuing might outweigh the reward. This internal reckoning reportedly culminated in a private statement. "I'm resigning." These words, calm yet resolute, are significant because they highlight a radical, yet deeply human, choice. Joshua's career has always demanded resilience, endurance, and public performance. To step away voluntarily, particularly in the wake of surviving a near-fatal accident, represents a confrontation with mortality and a reevaluation of values. The public narrative could not capture this complexity. Media outlets focused on speed limits, overtaking maneuvers, and the mechanics of the crash. Social media amplified clips of Joshua calm and composed. Fans celebrated survival. Analysts dissected the SUV's trajectory. But behind the scenes, the most consequential developments were unfolding in silence. Joshua's deliberation about risk, purpose, and personal boundaries. Near-death experiences have been studied extensively for their psychological impact. Survivors often report heightened clarity, reevaluation of priorities, and shifts in ambition. In Joshua's case, the experience exposed the limits of physical preparation and control. It underscored that survival is not guaranteed by strength, fame, or discipline. It is, in part, a matter of chance. And confronting this randomness can provoke decisions that defy conventional expectations of perseverance. Sources close to him indicate that discussions with family, advisors, and his team began immediately. These conversations reportedly centered on risk management, career implications, and the broader consequences of continuing in a high-stakes, high-risk profession.